Peter Moroney. He's a former police detective from New South Wales following the tragedy at the weekend at Bondi Junction. And you're also hearing a lot in the news about the escalating conflict in the Middle East. A lot of heavy news around it, as I mentioned earlier. I had to switch off for a little bit yesterday because it was all a lot and I just wanted to focus on the things that I could control. But these stories, they're important because they impact our lives either directly or indirectly, but they also affect the world around us. But they can also be a lot. So sometimes we do have to make that choice to disconnect. And let's chat more about all of this with psychology expert Dr. Jo Lukens. Good morning.
Good morning, Susan.
Dr. Jo, I mentioned how I noticed yesterday that I needed to disconnect. What are some of the sort of typical responses that we see following major heavy news events like these?
We will see a varied response, and it says a lot about who we are as people, but also what's happening for us in our own personal lives as well. So when something shocking and unexpected happens, and we know with a strong layer of tragedy across the top of it, it's going to be a range of emotions for people. So there might be feelings of fear, there might be feelings of worry and being scared. Certainly incredible sadness will be very common. Some people might feel numb, like almost like this doesn't feel real. I'm sure I misheard that. It can't have happened. And then people might feel frustrated or angry. So I guess the main thing for people to know is that experiencing a range or a combination of a lot of those things. So knowing that a range of emotional responses and people responding differently is important for us to know, because that's a very normal reaction in a horrendous situation such as this.
And I think sometimes when we see these major news events, particularly the incident at Bondi Junction, you hear the ages of the accused or the victims, and it's very easy to place yourself like, oh, that could have very easily happened to me.
Absolutely.
And I go to the shops, I went to the same high school as the gentleman. He was a year above me in school. It's how do you separate yourself from those things? Or can you?
I wonder if we do, because I think what we do as humans is we empathise with others. It's part of what's beautiful about humans is that we do find those moments of connection, and the more personalised a story becomes. So if you compare those two stories that you talked about, the specific instance that happened in New South Wales and then what's happening more broadly across the world, and when you hear, like you said, the demographics of someone, or even if you hear that it's somebody's daughter, someone that you know, you feel like you've got more of a connection with it. So I think it's important for us to understand that part of our nature as humans is to connect with stories, and that's why we do have those responses. And that's why, again, to your point, and the purpose of some of this discussion is how do we look after ourselves in a world that has sad and tragic news and events happening around us.
You mentioned a number of emotions. It can make you feel pretty powerless or defeated or unsafe or overwhelmed. What are some of the signs then that we need to look for to maybe say, okay, I need to step away from listening and watching the reporting or even just being on social media? What are some of the signs that we should be looking for?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So I guess it's keeping an eye on yourself. That almost imagine yourself looking into the mirror and going, how am I going? How am I feeling? What am I doing? Am I feeling myself feeling a bit more teary? And also being aware of what else is happening in your life, because your description of it, I think I've said it 10 times today, it's a lot at the moment of things that are happening for people. So if you know that you've got some things happening in your own personal life as well, that carries a heavy load. And so I think monitoring ourselves, and I would say definitely we live in a world now where we can access so much information. That doesn't mean we should always access that information. So knowing when to turn things off. Just before you and I communicated this morning about talking about this topic today, I had just deleted an email that I would normally read from a news source, and I just didn't because I saw what the heading was and I thought, I don't need that this morning. So it's okay to mentally step away and physically step away, particularly when it comes to the amount of information you can potentially absorb and your family.
How do we talk with our kids about these things? Do we talk with our kids?
Yeah, carefully. And as we've talked before, it's going to be age dependent as well. So if I have a teenager, and I do, who, for example, goes to shopping centres, and so this is an opportunity for us to talk a little bit about personal safety and to talk about those. But if I had a 4-year-old in my house that hadn't crossed paths with the news, I don't know what's to be gained by me being the person to tell them. Now, what might happen in my household is I might have the news on, my child might walk past as did when my kids were that age, and they might go, "Mummy, what is that?" or
Yeah.
whatever. And what you'll often find with younger ones is they'll often self-regulate the questions according to what they need. So I would always say, listen to the questions that they ask rather than then dumping a whole heap of information, because they're often very good at self-regulating what they need to know.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great way to look at it, because sometimes you go, I don't want to tell it anything, and then they ask a question and you just verbal.
Yes, and then you give them a half-hour response, possibly not what they need.
What is
Yes,
happening?
it's too much for them.
If people need to seek help, that you've said to have a look at how, and to look within yourself to think about how you might be feeling, what are the steps that we should take if we do go, I need to have help in this area?
Yeah, well,
it's too much.
Absolutely. First of all, well done for recognising that within yourself is what I would say. And you will probably find there are lots of discussions in households, in workplaces about this. So being mindful about whether you want to be in those conversations or not, and being mindful that you don't know what the other person you're talking to potentially needs. But talking helps us make sense of these things. We don't like a world that feels out of control and unpredictable, so it's challenging when that happens. And then, of course, if this is triggering something for you, or if you might be having a really strong reaction to this and going, I don't know why this is affecting me so much, it might be the other stuff that's happening in your life. So finding a professional to talk to, you can always start with your GP or a counsellor, can be helpful.
Thank you very much for that. Psychology expert, Dr. Jo Lukens, thank you very much for your time this morning.